For some reason.
We'll wait a couple more minutes while everyone gets on.
Hello, Joseph.
You made it. Wonderful.
Oh, yes.
Protect your voice. We got a little while.
Oh, yes, I lost my voice, but I can speak. I can speak.
Okay, well, you got a little while to rest it. Thank you. I'm glad you made it. Give it another minute, and then we are off to the races. Okay, well, everybody's time is important. And so even while some people are still joining us, I think we'll begin. Good afternoon, good evening, and for some of you, good morning. My name is Joseph Gerson, and I'm happy to be welcoming you to this North American launch of Common Security 2022 on behalf of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, Peace Quest in Canada, Peace Action, and the International Peace Bureau. As we begin, I want to appreciate and celebrate the deeply experienced, wise, and dedicated women and men from 7 countries who will be speaking today, who have made major contributions to the urgently needed Common Security Report for our shared future. Last week, on the 40th anniversary of the Palme Commission's Common Security Report, which paved the way for the INF Treaty and the end to the 20th century Cold War, the Olaf Palme Foundation, the International Peace Bureau, and the International Trade Union Confederation issued its visionary yet realistic vision and roadmap for international cooperation needed to overcome the existential nuclear, climate, and pandemic threats and to secure human security and justice. Anna Sundstrom of the Olaf Palme Center will provide background and origins and also speak about the process and content of this visionary report. When the report's international commissioners began their work, the shattering of the post-Cold War and Cold War orders with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the devastating war which has again brought us to the brink of great power and nuclear war, they were still beyond actually the horizon. But as the forward to the Common Security Report reminds us, in times of acute crisis, there must be those who can look ahead and give vision for a better future. Even as we must do all that we can to prevent the widening of the Ukraine war and bring it to an end through negotiations, we must also be planning for a more peaceful, just, and environmentally sustainable future. The report's authors have done just that. They have given us a roadmap for ways that we can work together across our differences to make the world better. I'd like you also to appreciate that not unlike the difficult bridging of the challenges of inter and intrastate common security and diplomacy, the challenges of hammering out a detailed set of recommendations, especially amidst a catastrophic war, was no easy exercise. It required difficult discussions, late night meetings, and compromises. But we now have their inspiring vision and recommendations that can serve our movements, civil society, and in time, governments. And they have provided a model for ways to work across and through differences that can and should be emulated by governments. In introducing the panel in the report, let me stress the fundamental insight of today's and the original Common Security Report. One nation cannot achieve security at the expense of rivals, but only in collaboration with that rival. As a foundation for the 21st century report, the commissioners began by identifying and agreeing on a set of 6 principles, which you'll see here. Can we put them up? Okay. I also want to say that, I guess before I get out of the way, I want to acknowledge the challenging times that we live in, but also to remind us of Margaret Mead's insight that we should never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only way that ever has. It was the combination of a relatively small group of people who ignited a massive global disarmament movement in the first years of the 1980s, and a small group of wise leaders that Olaf Palme assembled, who gave us the original Common Security Report and that path that led to the end of the Cold War. The challenge for us today is to redouble our commitments and our courage to bring the world out of crises and into a life-affirming common security shared future. I do have, as we begin, I do have some good news to share. The report has already received encouraging responses in the German press, with Berlin's leading newspaper having devoted many pages to it. And it is already being circulated within track 2 diplomatic processes, which means it's getting into the minds and thinking of at least sectors of the global elite. With 7 extraordinary speakers, we have structured today's webinar in 2 panels. Each of our speakers will speak for up to 10 minutes. There will be a question and answer period after each panel. And I trust that you know, after a couple of years of the pandemic, how to pose your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom and center of your screen. I'll do my best to get to as many of the questions as I can. So let me then introduce our first speakers. Anna Sundstrom is Secretary General of the Olaf Palme International Center. She came to the Palme Center from her post as an advisor at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has previously worked as an International Secretary of the Social Democratic Women's Organization, as International Secretary and Policy Advisor to the Swedish Parliament, and immediately prior to coming to the Palme Center, becoming the Palme Center's Secretary General, she served as that organization's head of operations. Because it is now 2 a.m. in Beijing, Zhao Tong will be joining us via a video recording. Dr. Zhao is a senior fellow of the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Beijing. His research focuses on security issues such as nuclear weapons policies, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, and China's security and foreign policy. He serves on the board of directors of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and on the advisory board of the Missile Dialogue Initiative. I want to say that it's a special pleasure to be introducing Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, a career Austrian diplomat who is serving as the president-designate of the first meeting of states parties of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. He's doing so alongside his role as Director of Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Earlier, Ambassador Kmentt served as Austria's permanent representative to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union, responsible for developing the EU's common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy. He is an uncommon and deeply committed diplomat. When we first met and worked together in Nagasaki, I was impressed by how deeply he engaged and internalized the painful testimonies of A-bomb survivors. His role in bringing the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons into being should not be underestimated. So with that, let me give the floor then to Anna. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you very much for having me and for this opportunity to also launch our report. Once again, the launch was held in Sweden last week, and we are now, of course, intensely occupied with also launching it in the other parts of the world and also spreading the news. So I'm happy to be here with you all this evening. Or it's evening in Sweden for sure, but happy, as I said, to be here. So as Joseph already in his introduction said, this year marks the 40th anniversary of Olaf Palme's Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues. The Commission presented its report in 1992 at the height of the Cold War and developed the concept of common security. The idea that nations and populations can only feel safe when their counterparts feel safe. The concept itself is based on a number of principles, including that all nations have the right to security, that military force is not a legitimate means for resolving disputes between nations, and that reductions and limits on arms are necessary for mutual security. In times of acute crisis, as Joseph also underlined, there must be those who can look ahead and give a vision of a better future. So 40 years ago, the relationship was at the rock bottom between the superpowers, and the risk of a devastating nuclear war was high. The introduction of common security showed that security is something that we create together. More and more powerful weapons are not the answer. Once again, the world now stands at the same crossroads, faced with a choice between an existence based on confrontation and aggression, or one to be rooted in a transformative peace agenda and common security. In 2022, humanity faces the existential threats of nuclear war, climate change, and pandemics. This is compounded by a toxic mix of inequality, extremism, nationalism, gender violence, and shrinking democratic space. How humanity responds to these threats will decide our very survival. And we think that the concept of common security holds the necessary key for survival. So by taking the concept of common security as its starting point, the Common Security 2022 initiative has analyzed the world we live in today and some of the great challenges facing humanity. We have had the great support of our high-level advisory commission, a highly qualified and hugely experienced group of people from all over the world, but also all the experts and scholars who participated in a webinar series. And the collective knowledge and expertise of all of these individuals is what truly makes this initiative so unique. All have provided invaluable input to this report. The views and opinions expressed in the report do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of all those involved. So when the Olaf Palme International Center, together with IPB and ITUC, started this journey about a year ago now, little did we know of the situation we would find ourselves in when presenting this report. Some may say that it is naive to even talk about peace, disarmament and common security when the world is on the brink of a new world war. But on the contrary, now, more than ever, we need a strong discourse for peace. The international order, which enables us to prevent wars, stop global warming, fight a pandemic, and tackle global challenges, simply does not work well enough. We have to fix it for our shared future. To turn the tide, we must reaffirm the UN Charter. International cooperation and respect for international law must be fundamental to all states. We need to revitalize and implement the call by the UN Secretary General for a worldwide ceasefire. We must reinforce respect for international humanitarian law and for the UN Charter's prohibition against the use of force and inviolability of borders. We must also realize that global peace and security are created jointly. We must recognize that the threat of nuclear war and climate change are both existential threats to humanity. We need to strengthen trust between states and people and build a world order based on human needs. We must also ensure inclusive governance at all levels in society. So 40 years on from the original Palme Commission, the challenges of our interdependent global society demands more than ever collaboration and partnership rather than isolation and distrust. Our common systems and structures need to provide security, combat poverty and inequality, and prevent human suffering. These systems are inadequate and far too often ignored or violated. So in the report, as has been mentioned, we have developed 6 new principles for common security based on the principles in the original report, focusing on human security, building trust between nations and people, and also regional and global cooperation, and dialogue, conflict prevention, international law, and responsible governance. And the report has also includes also a series of recommendations, indications, or steps forward in the process of turning around the supertanker of war. They are practical steps, but also set out the vision for a better and safer world. They aim to motivate public opinion and have a positive impact on policy and decision makers about what is necessary and achievable. It is for all of us to take these proposals forward. There is still much work to do to realize Olaf Palme's vision of common security. But I will end by quoting another great leader, Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you really for the wonderful work that you've done in initiating and guiding the report through to now its availability to the world. I'm going to ask Mariana Fernandez, who is our just indispensable technological guru and the woman anchoring this webinar, now to, if you can broadcast the video from Dr. Zhao Tong, if you would. You need to get it started here if you can.
Yes, I'm sorry, just 1 second. No, what is not showing the video. Okay, I'm gonna try again.
Thank you very much.
We need sound.
International Trade Union Confederation and the International Peace Bureau for jointly conducting this project and for organizing this session. It's my great honor and pleasure to contribute to the Common Security 2022 initiative, which produced this report on common security. I think the report offers some very useful big ideas, as well as concrete suggestions on practical steps to implement common security. My area of specialty is nuclear policy and nuclear security. The report already points out that today the world is facing growing nuclear threats, not only the threat of nuclear arms race, but also the actual use, the threat of the actual use of nuclear weapons. The reason the nuclear risks and threats are growing is very much because in many societies, power-centric mindset is so popular and so widespread. For example, in some nuclear weapon states, the general public and many experts believe that the most important nature of the international relationship is anarchy. And we live in a world where the jungle's laws apply, where international principles, laws, rules, and norms are not really absolute, and the big powers manipulate them and bend them to fit their own interests. And this is the popular interpretation, popular understanding about the nature of international relations in many societies. And according to this perspective, material power, military power, bigger arsenals are the only way to defend one's security and interests. And one has to be more powerful than others in order to be able to make international rules as the only way to defend one's legitimate security interests. I think this power-centric mindset directly contradicts the idea of common security and poses a major obstacle to implement common security in practice. In many societies, the idea of common security is also officially promoted on surface, but actually laughed at by the general public and by the experts as naive, and even as propaganda by Western countries and Western groups. Part of this, I think, is a result of a lack of deep understanding about history, how during and after the Cold War, genuine and sincere efforts were made across the world to study and spread the idea of common security. How questions were addressed one by one by supporters of common security, how deep suspicions were gradually mitigated because of efforts made by common security supporters, how key individuals devoted their careers, life, and even sacrificed their health to repeatedly try and eventually managed to make some progress to promote common security. This lack of understanding about the history of common security campaign is one problem. Another is a lack of understanding about the substantive provisions, elements, and meaning of the abstract concept of common security. Those who laugh at common security are often those who also know very little about how common security is actually supposed to work in practice. And therefore, I think this report on common security makes a big contribution by conveying two important messages. One is, this is a serious and sincere effort. This is not government propaganda. This is the product by experts, many of whom are extremely experienced experts and former officials who already have distinguished careers, but are still fighting to promote these ideas because they believe these ideas offer the best hope for resolving some of the most pressing challenges today, including existential challenges like nuclear arms race and climate change. And therefore, these ideas deserve to be treated and studied and examined very seriously. Second, I think the report offers concrete suggestions on common security. These suggestions would be particularly helpful to those who only have a vague idea about common security. It is very important to have much broader public discussion and debate about the approach of common security. The reason common security is ridiculed in some societies is a lack of real public attention, discussion, or debate. Some officials, diplomats may have made a speech. Some scholars may have written about common security to support government talking points in many countries. But they don't really believe in it. Their study, their speech is often very shallow and superficial. This report, however, offers some concrete and substantive ideas and explains how these ideas can and should be implemented in practice. And therefore, hopefully, it can help stimulate really serious public attention, interest, discussion, and debate. The last point I want to make is, in order to promote common security, we need perhaps to address some fundamental challenges today. One of them is the growing information gap and perception gap between the societies in Western countries, in Russia, and in China. The reality today is that the information gap and perception gap is preventing these societies from understanding each other, let alone working together and cooperating. The lack of free flow of information and the systematic management of information access and public opinion is so serious that the people have fundamentally divergent views on even basic factual issues across national borders. Many what Western people view as indisputable conspiracy theories are genuinely believed by Russian and Chinese people. I cannot emphasize enough how this creates huge divergence in public opinion and deep distrust, and make people live in parallel universes. When the majority of Russian and Chinese people, experts, officials view the West as nothing but hegemonic and evil, it is no surprise that the idea of common security is too easily dismissed as naive, if not disguised propaganda. There is no surprise that there is little interest in such countries to actively pursue common security. The Ukraine invasion, which is overwhelmingly condemned by the West, but largely supported by the Russian people, shows that information gap and the perception gap leads to war that affects everyone. It poses the greatest threat to international peace and stability and the greatest obstacle to implement common security. For this reason, I believe civil societies, expert communities, and peace organizations should pay attention to this fundamental problem and should make efforts to understand and then seriously tackle this problem in our future efforts to implement common security. With that, thank you very much for your time.
I found Dr. Zhao's talk both just very profound and I think just very important, and I'm just so glad that he shared it with us. I noted that a couple of people raised their hands, and we're not dealing with questions in that way. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your paper. I think also Dr. Zhao's talk in a way provides a very natural segue to that by Ambassador Kmentt. And so, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak in this panel. I have to say I find it a bit difficult to speak after Tong Zhao because I agree with you. I think his points were extremely pertinent. It was a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to contribute to the report, which I did in my personal capacity. And I agree very much with what was said, that while we are at a very dangerous moment, it's precisely that makes work on common security so important, and that shows the value of bringing together a diverse group of people to try to talk and to address some of these issues. We are indeed on the cusp of an uncontrolled drive towards militarization. I very much agree with Tong Zhao's point on the lack of understanding of what common security actually means, how easily it is dismissed often. I agree with him when he speaks about the lack of historical knowledge and the superficiality of the debate, and of course on the importance of much broader discourse that goes for all the issues. And what makes me optimistic is that, of course, we are at the same time more connected than we've ever been. Probably it wasn't so easy in 1982 for a Chinese expert to participate in an effort like that and to just send a video through the internet. So this interconnectedness makes me a little bit more optimistic. The conclusion of the 1982 report, or a key conclusion, was that international security must rest on a commitment of joint survival rather than a threat of mutual destruction. And I think that remains as pertinent as ever, and even more so now, where the existential threat of nuclear war that many of us in the West thought is an issue of the past, that risk, the existential risk and the risk of nuclear rhetoric escalating, has of course come to the fore very much in recent weeks with the developments. So people are scared, and there is an emotional reaction that's probably understandable in many countries for more security, and in an emotional analysis that may mean more weapons. And that's probably understandable, but it remains very questionable if this, at the end of the day, is the right pathway for security in general and for common security more broadly. If the conclusion remains unchallenged that everybody needs more weapons and more military spending, this will of course mean more armaments. This will mean more focus on nuclear weapons. And the result of the end of this process is obvious. If everybody has more of these weapons, it's very unlikely that this will remain stable. Rather, the opposite is more likely. And some parallels being made to either the time before the First World War or the 1930s, I think are very pertinent. And that brings us back to the point that Tong just made before on the importance of understanding history. I'm, of course, also a non-proliferation and disarmament expert, so I will speak briefly on two aspects in the report, which I think are absolutely fundamental aspects. is the aspect of multilateralism and international law, and how it pertains to nuclear weapons, of course, but more broadly to trying to control weapons. Secondly, on the threat posed specifically of nuclear weapons, and then also on the threat posed by new technologies. And I think the report makes some very important recommendations in those areas. Of course, we are right in the middle of a crisis and complete breakdown of international security. So the value of treaties may look weak or may look distant. But in fact, we have seen, Tong was talking about the efforts immediately after the Cold War to strengthen these treaties, and that's true, that was in the 1990s. But we have seen, in fact, 2.5 decades of wasted opportunities of dismantling of bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties, and specifically wasted opportunities. So the report makes some very important recommendations on simply refocusing on this, because multilateral cooperation, specifically in the field of disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation, is fundamentally a common security approach, because if good faith efforts are undertaken to reach an agreement, that automatically takes into account different security perspectives. And we have seen, unfortunately, in the last 25 years, very zero-sum game approaches to multilateral institutions in general, but in this field in particular. And the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is a key victim of that. Such a fundamental treaty whose credibility has been fundamentally undermined. The second point is now specifically the threat of nuclear weapons that, as I said, was often overlooked in the West and limited in the eyes of some to the North Korean issue or to the proliferation challenge of Iran. Well, that is now over, because it's very clear to everybody that these weapons remain an existential threat, and the practice of nuclear deterrence, as practiced by 9 states that have these weapons, who are all in mutual deterrence relationships, essentially based on the threat of mass destruction. That has come to the fore with a vengeance, given the explicit nuclear threats that have been made. So that, of course, is extremely disconcerting, but there the report also makes some important points. And I think the key aspect there is going back also to the language, to the fundamental conclusion from 1982, is to change the thinking. It is, to me at least, blatantly obvious that more nuclear weapons, more focus on an understanding of security that is based on mass destruction is not a sustainable approach, cannot be a sustainable approach, and will ultimately lead to terrible nuclear war, and also increases dramatically the risks of accidents and miscalculations and so on. We know that, we have empirical evidence for it, that the consequences of these weapons are even far more severe than previously known, and the risks of things going wrong also being far more serious.
Ambassador Kmentt, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, I've got, good. So it's extremely important to change the thinking. It's extremely important to move away from an abstract consideration that nuclear deterrence will work because these weapons are never used, to an understanding that the fundamental basis of nuclear deterrence is the use of these weapons, the credible threat of using these weapons. So the report makes some very important points. And of course, the treaty where I have the honor of being chair at the moment is based on this thinking. And lastly, very briefly, I think it is also extremely important to make the wider public understand the fundamental challenges posed by new technologies that are out there, from artificial intelligence to vulnerability of cyber war, and other aspects. And one thing I just want to highlight is the threshold that we're about to change in a phase of geopolitical competition of autonomous weapon systems, weapons that make a decision to take the lives of humans based on pre-programmed algorithms. We are just on the cusp of this development, and that is extremely a fundamental moment. And we can only stop this by working together to prevent it. And we see exactly the opposite trend, that everybody mistrusts each other, and the development of these weapons is taking place at a rapid pace. We have a very narrow window to close to deal with this in a preventative way. So the report also makes some important points there. And just by closing, it is exactly at that moment in history and at that moment of geopolitical tensions that common thinking on common security is indispensable. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I have been a little bit over time.
Ambassador Kmentt, thank you so much. And, you know, I have to say that I'm glad that we have a really quite significant audience of community-based and national movement and public opinion figures who can help to build on what you've said. I mean, you're living quite within the realm of the dangers that we face, and encourage people to really look at the report to see the number of rather concrete suggestions there. We've got maybe about just shy of about 10 minutes for Q&A before we go to the next panel. And some of the questions that we've gotten, I think, may be more appropriate for the next panel. The two questions along the same path here. Well, maybe just begin here with Dennis Wong's question. What are the top two obstacles for any and all nations to accept and abide by a common security agreement? Professor Zhao referred to this, but Anna and Alexandra, if you could speak to that, that would be really helpful.
Well, I think that one problem is, of course, the sort of the basic notion of how you create security. And I think that we are still far too many in our minds sort of set to automatically think that military and arms will keep us safe. So that is sort of one problem, which would then lead to a spiral of armament, so to say. The other one would, of course, be what to say, intentions or wishes to expand your territory, or to the sort of the conflicts that exists in so many places still over borders, right? And that is sort of a fundamental issue, of course, and a fundamental problem to the realization that you cannot create your own security at the expense of someone else's. Just a short remark.
Just very briefly, I agree with the points that Anna just made. I think it is mistrust and lack of confidence building measures, and then very importantly, as Anna said, too narrow understanding of security. I find it so incredibly depressing that after the world being in the grip of a pandemic for over 2 years, where all of us have understood, I mean, have felt insecure in entirely different ways, and have all understood, despite the problems with distribution of vaccines, but we have all understood that the only way to tackle this security threat is through cooperation. And that immediately after the veil or the burden of this pandemic disappears a bit, we fall into a security crisis which in terms of discourse takes us back into the worst moments of geopolitical competitions. It's tragic, rather than using the joint experience of a different that should have enabled a different security discourse, that we falling back. We just all make a huge step backwards in an understanding of security, which is really terrible. So I think the small contribution that we can do with this report makes it even more important against this massive negative trend.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions in here which I want to honor, but I think they may be best answered after the second panel. So those who've submitted them, I hope you'll be patient with me. And then a question here from Hayat Imam, who's just a really wonderful community leader here in the Boston area, asking for pointers for community efforts for public education along the lines covered by Dr. Zhao. And does the report speak to public education efforts, or if not, what are your thoughts about what can best be done in this regard?
Shall I take this first, because I just have a small aspect in relation to the discussion around nuclear weapons. I think that is why the TPNW is such an important treaty, because it is based on empirically demonstrable facts around the consequences of what really happens when these weapons are used, and a much better understanding of the risks. And that is something that is obviously not limited to a security policy expert group, but something the wider public can relate to. And we have seen that in the whole process leading up to the treaty. It's far too small yet. Einstein said already in 1946 that the only way to save us is a much broader public understanding about this. So one pointer on the issue of nuclear weapons is really talking about these weapons, not in the abstract nuclear deterrence context, but rather what they do and how dangerous they are.
I can just briefly add and say that, yes, the report talks to this, and there is also one recommendation specifically also suggesting that the mandate and resources of the UN Peacebuilding Fund and Commission should be expanded so that it can also be used in transnational dialogue processes, people-to-people contact and collaboration, and democratic mobilization, and also to continue its focus on women-centered peace-building solution, as well as using the fund to increase the number of multidisciplinary, multicultural, and multi-faith peace universities, colleges, and congresses, ensuring that they are present in regions and nations also at risk, and that these institutions give younger generations the knowledge and skills and tools to create the conditions and institutions for practical conflict resolution and peace.
Okay, let me use this opportunity to remind people that the link to the full report is in the chat, and you can download it or simply look at it online and look at this in considerable detail. Do one more question before we go into the next panel from Laura Halder, asking, how do we stop the pre-programmed weapons? The fully automated weapons. How can this be stopped before we can't put the genie back in that bottle?
Shall I take that? First of all, there is a massive discrepancy between the few people, civil society activists, and diplomatic experts who try and think about how to regulate this, against the masses of brilliant programmers working in various tech companies on the technology, not even knowing what the military applications of their work could be. So that is one aspect, is awareness raising among the IT community, and there are some very interesting things going on. But it is actually possible to do that, because no state wants this, but many of the major actors are so distrustful of their opponents that they think they have to do it too, because their opponents are going to do that. So the only way to deal it in a preventative way is to have a multilateral agreement that guarantees human control over autonomous weapon systems, so that the final decision on engagement, meaning on killing, is not done by pre-programmed algorithms, but there always must be human control, and therefore also human accountability and responsibility. And that is easy to do. It's a political problem why we are not getting there, and it goes back to the whole issue of mistrust and geopolitical tensions.
Thank you. I want to thank Anna and Ambassador Kmentt for your contributions as we've begun this webinar. And I just also want to call people's attention to the fact that even as we are into the depths of what we have to say is a new Cold War, or maybe worse, just to remember that back during the depths of the Cold War, we had negotiations which led to arms control agreements, reductions of nuclear weapons, and of course the Common Security Report itself. So as difficult as the situation is now, the reality is that through diplomacy, we can move forward. With that, we're going to move to the second panel. We've changed the order a little bit because Professor Anno Chenoy is joining us from India, and maybe early evening in Europe, but it is early hours of the morning in India. So I just want to especially appreciate Anno for making the effort to join us rather than via a video which she had sent. I'll run through introductions of the four speakers, and then we'll go in that order. So Professor Chenoy is the former dean at the School of International Studies at the I always mispronounce it, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She has been a chairperson of the area studies and director of the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. She has written many books, monographs, and articles focused on security studies, development studies, and gender studies. She has held short-term consultancies with the International Commission of the Red Cross, UNESCO, ActionAid International, UN Women, UN Peacekeepers, and she has worked with the focus on the Global South and the Asia-Europe People's Forum, which is how I best know her, where I've been privileged to know and work with her. She will be followed by Ambassador Sergio Duarte. It's a real privilege to have him joining us. He's had a distinguished career as a Brazilian diplomat and now serves as the president of the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs. Ambassador Duarte served as the United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. He was president of the 2005 Review Conference for the parties to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, known as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review. He has served on the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, including as chairman. He has also served in various diplomatic posts in Geneva and elsewhere. He's been the ambassador to a number of countries representing Brazil. I have to say that over the years, I've been impressed by Ambassador Duarte's wisdom, his commitments to peace and disarmament, and on many occasions, he's gone out of his way to join civil society and movement efforts to help us understand both the importance and possibilities of nuclear disarmament. Then turning to Dr. Alexey Gromyko, since the International Peace Bureau's World Conference this past October, I've had the privilege of knowing and working with him. He is a corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a director of the Academy's Institute of Europe, and president of the Russian Association of European Studies. He's also chairman of the Andrei Gromyko Association of Policy Studies, which is named for his grandfather, who was the Soviet Union's foreign minister. And he's been a member of the Research Council for the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia and of the Research Council and Russian Security Council. Someone can deal with that noise there. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contemporary Europe, executive editor of the Journal of Social Sciences and Contemporary World. If somebody who's, you need to mute yourself there. In addition to his very important contributions to Common Security 2022, both before and now during the Ukraine war, he has done important work in the cause of ensuring the strategic stability among the great powers. Then last but hardly least is Reiner Braun, my friend and dear colleague, who is the executive director of the International Peace Bureau. Along with IPB's co-president, Philip Jennings, he was the driving force behind the creation of Common Security 22. He's been active in the peace movement for 4 decades, having begun with the Krefelder Appeal against nuclear weapons in Europe in 1982. He was the executive director for Scientists for Peace and Sustainability, and worked with the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility beginning in the 1990s. He worked on various projects related to the Einstein Year at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and for the Max Planck Society. He served as the executive director of ILANA in Germany, as well as the International ILANA. From 2006 to 2012, he was the executive director of the German Pugwash group. He has served as IPB's co-president from 2013 to 2019, and has since served as the organization's executive director. He also has played major roles in launching the No to War NATO network, and is the author of many books and articles. So with that, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph. And the panel so far has been wonderful, and I think I've learned a lot, and I agree with everything they have said. I really welcome this remarkable document to the new Common Security, because it is timely and appropriate update of the Palme Commission vision document of the 1983. It's important because I think it advances the common security concept to address a world that has shifted from a bipolar Cold War one to one with emerging multiple powers, and yet where several wars are ongoing and a new Cold War looms. Now, this new common security document brings in the wealth of new ideas, discoveries, the advances in science, understanding, human experience, conversations of the last 40 years together succinctly. It intertwines the ideas of challenging climate, the problems of ecology, sustainable development, the importance of centering women and civil society in peace and security, and the importance of democratizing and empowering the UN General Assembly. So decisions are not centralized and in the interest of some alone. The new common security builds, I think it's embedded in many philosophies, from Aristotle on common good, to the rationalists, to recent feminist thinkers, to the decolonizing theorists, critical thinkers, ecologists, human security theorists, and many others. Their ideas come into this one document. So the challenge of our time is, how does common security become a common goal and common sense, a popular common sense, and what blocks it? Now, the non-acceptance of common security is, one of the major reasons, I believe, is a belief that power is indivisible and cannot be shared, that competition must lead to the victory of only one, and one system and its ideas must prevail. The perception that all good values rest entirely with one belief system, even after attaining global capitalism. These set of beliefs extend to an intolerance of difference, and even intolerance to accept a truce. Now, such beliefs are backed by great financial, technological, military, and nuclear power. However, on the contrary, it cannot be denied that finance today has reached a level where no one state can control it. And we can see that technology, communication, weapons, no one state or even an alliance of states can control it, or manage climate change, or control social change. So there is really no future for exclusion or primacy or for unipolarity. The future is the commons and it is collaborative. Further, look at the map, for example, of sanctions on account of wars. Who is imposing sanctions? Who is opposing these? Or look at the list of interventions and support to wars and armed conflicts, or the list of who has dropped bombs and on which people and which countries are impacted by these bombs. There is a trend here that cannot be denied, and it says something about hegemonies, about dominant perceptions. Now, I am not for one at all arguing that the global south is either passive, normative, or value-laden set of countries. No, in fact, it is a region with the most ethnic identity conflicts, human security crises, where one group has tried to impose its will on others, and the powerful in regimes most often want their ideas to prevail. And it is the region with the least internal freedoms and the greatest inequality. Yet it opposes sanctions, it condemns interstate wars, it is not dropping bombs on each other, and yet the South has no one single institution that can represent it. Therefore, I believe that the 4 recommendations of this report, from reinitiating disarmament, demilitarization, democratizing the UN, having a new security, international security structure, which is inclusive and is the way forward for peace, democracy, and sustainable development, and would be extremely important for the global South. I therefore endorse every word of this document, and I believe that millions around the world would do so as they would have done so in the past if they come to know about it, if it's introduced to them in some way through social media and new communications. And if there is one clear lesson to be learned from international security and the history of international relations, it is this: that without common and collaborative security, we on this planet will be an increasingly endangered species. This report establishes this. Thank you very much.
Anno, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us at this late hour for you. It's clear that in addition to being a professor, you're also a diplomat. As you were running through the list of, if you will, of atrocities, and referred to them as trends, as an American, I could only think in terms of our history and what's been done here. I remember during the Vietnam War, people who became my teachers used to say that the US war in Vietnam was not an aberration, but they didn't explain why that was the case. We had to go find that out. So I'm trusting that people who heard you speak will do some deeper digging. With that, I want to give the floor to Ambassador and now President of Pugwash, Sergio Duarte. And in doing so, expecting that he'll focus considerably on nuclear weapons, to just underline just how central nuclear disarmament is to human survival, an absolute foundation. Without human survival, we don't have common security. Ambassador Duarte, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Joseph Gerson, and I wish to say that I fully agree with the previous speakers. I could not add one word to what they said. And I thank very much the campaign of peace, disarmament, and common security for inviting me to participate in the preparation of this report, and particularly Anna Sundstrom for her guidance during the elaboration of the report. The existential threat that haunts the world today is the result of our own actions. Consequently, it falls on us to find the instruments necessary to counter and eliminate such threats and to make the world more secure. Secretary General of the United Nations noted recently that humanity faces a stark choice between breakthrough or breakdown, as he put it, either a future of perpetual crisis or a greener, safer, and better future for all. The invitation to this session stressed also that the world stands at a crossroads, and the choice is between an existence based on competition and aggression, or one rooted in peace and common security. The way in which we respond to the existential threats of the current times will define our very survival. The community of nations must be able to build a global order that can deal successfully with these threats. We do not know exactly how many millennia ago human beings started their ascent among other species to become dominant over the planet. But we can identify in the Industrial Revolution the beginning of the rapid development of science, manufacturing techniques, trade, and other skills that allowed unprecedented material progress and accelerated since the second half of this century, of the past century. Humanity's saga in search of material satisfaction, physical security, and spiritual fulfillment is at the same time impressive and frightening. In the relative short span of about 3 centuries, man became the greatest predator of finite resources at his reach, and the inventor of the most destructive weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, human prowess made possible ever more bountiful harvests and wider use of instruments that make life easier and more rewarding. Unfortunately, however, the fruits of this new wave of progress are still not fairly shared. A significant part of the inhabitants of our planet survive without the essential elements for dignified existence. At this point in the evolution of the history of the human race, we need to ponder where we might find ourselves in the not so distant future. Our own hubris gave us the label of Homo sapiens, but there is considerable uncertainty about the wisdom of our own actions. The disheartening aspects of the present security situation are further compounded by more immediate and fearsome prospects. The 2 major sources of dread, namely the existence of nuclear weapons and climate change, to these we must add the possibility of the upsurge of new pandemics that may spread around the globe rapidly and with deadlier consequences. The atomic threat emerged 75 years ago. From then on, the destructive potential of nuclear arsenals has increased exponentially with the development of new weapons and offensive systems. Although the total amount of nuclear warheads in the hands of small number of nations has been significantly reduced in relation to the record 70,000 reached at the height of the Cold War. Mistrust, animosity, and competition have for a long time hampered the effectiveness and reach of the instruments developed and adopted as universal norms of behavior and cast doubt on their permanence. In the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the prospect of mutual assured destruction, aptly described by the acronym MAD, was gradually replaced by a sort of complacency based on the conviction, or rather the hope, that nuclear deterrence doctrines would prevent catastrophe. The 2 main nuclear powers recognized by the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, devoted enormous financial, human, and technological resources to reinforce their warfighting capabilities in search of an elusive supremacy. To this day, both countries continue engaged in a blind race for new and more destructive armaments, followed at a considerable distance by China. Some countries acquired their own capability, although at levels much below those of the United States, Russia, and China. All of them seem to consider the NPT as bestowing on the current possessors of nuclear weapons a kind of license to continue development and to retain indefinitely their arsenals, while all others are legally forbidden to follow their example. Meanwhile, the overwhelming majority of the international community realized that the acquisition of atomic armament would be detrimental to their own security and that of the world at large, as well as counterproductive from the point of view of world stability. Accordingly, most countries gradually came to accept the discrimination between nuclear and non-nuclear countries inherent to the NPT, in the hope that the vague promise of disarmament contained in Article 6 would become reality. All states are today members of the United Nations, and as such, they are committed to observe the principles and purposes enshrined in the Charter and to respect the territorial integrity and political independence of any state, as well as to refrain from the use or threat of force and to resolve disputes by peaceful means. During the several decades of the existence of the UN, however, many states, particularly the most powerful among them, have not always acted in accordance with their pledges. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia last February was the latest and perhaps the most blatant case of disregard for the norms of international law. The Russian action shook the very foundations of the existing international order and caused a sharp change in the relationship between states, including some that are not directly involved in the conflict. The threat or actual use of nuclear weapons and the sharp growth in military expenditures increased the perception of fragility of the current security architecture. The erosion of confidence in the existing security system is even more alarming in view of the toxic mix of extremism, exacerbated nationalism, and reduction of democratic space in several countries. This reality renders urgently necessary the development of a new security paradigm based on cooperation for peace and development, reduction of authoritarianism, limitation of conventional armaments, and the abolition of all weapons of mass destruction. The Olaf Palme International Center called upon a group of diplomats, academics, specialists in international relations, and members of non-governmental organizations to update the report prepared in 1982. The new report, launched last week, highlights the need to reaffirm the Charter of the United Nations and respect for international law, including in its humanitarian aspects. And it particularly stresses the importance that the international order must be based on human need, as there can be no peace without development and no development without peace. Both would not exist without respect for human rights. And I think these teachings should be spread worldwide because they are very important for the future of humankind. Finally, I just congratulate the Olaf Palme Center on this timely initiative, and I'm sure that the international community will recognize the relevance of the report to the building of a much needed security paradigm that will be better able to respond to the threats of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Duarte, thank you so much. You know, I've always looked to you as a fount of wisdom, and sometimes, you know, the unflinching view of the world and what is needed. As you were speaking, I was thinking I look forward to having a copy of your speech in writing, and we'll work on transcripts of the other speeches so that we can make them available to people in another form. With that,
I'll be glad to send it to you.
Thank you. With that, I want to turn to Dr. Alexey Gromyko. I want to thank him, I guess, especially in two regards as we begin. One, just given the intensity of the moment that we all face. And secondly, I know that his voice has been thinking about deserting him. And I just want to appreciate the extra effort he's given to join us today. So Dr. Gromyko, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Indeed, a couple of days ago, I lost my voice, but I will make my best to speak my mind. I have been privileged to be a member of the high-level advisory commission, which has contributed to the project and to the publication of the report. Not all the views in the report reflect my personal and professional opinion, which I made clear to my colleagues. But I support most of it, especially and wholeheartedly the 6 Common Security 2022 principles. Let me speak at more length about the hard security part of our deliberations, picking up on some ideas touched upon by several colleagues before me. In fact, 3 out of 6 principles of the report are generally dedicated to issues of hard security, namely principles 3, 5, and 6. I do not want to duplicate the text of the document. Instead, I want to develop on what is said there. And basically, with all the radical changes which we have experienced since 1982, the meaning is the same as it was 40 years ago. The prevention of a major war, of a new major war, and pursuing a peaceful settlement of numerous disputes and conflicts. According to CIPRI, in 2021, the world military expenditure for the first time in history exceeded $2 trillion. In nominal terms, in 2021, it rose by 6.1%. 2021 became the 7th year in a row of a constant increase in military spending. Some people interpret it as a glass being half full, not half empty. And one may point out that this spending share in the world GDP is 2.2%, and that this share is less in 2021 than in 2020 in relative terms. However, from my point of view, this is a sheer complacency, and the reasons for that are 5-fold. Firstly, in the past, the world suffered from disastrous wars, including the 2 world wars, with a much lower share of military expenditure in its GDP and with much less destructive arms and weapons. Secondly, these spendings are highly concentrated, as more than 60% of it is generated by just 6 countries. Among them, the United States dwarfs all the others with a staggering $800 billion defense budget. It is followed by China with 293 billion, then by India with 76 billion, then the United Kingdom with 68, and then by Russia with 66 billion. Thirdly, more and more money is spent on new military research and development, on new military technologies and testing, both nuclear and conventional, which may have a huge destabilizing effect on regional security and strategic stability. The mutual assured destruction doctrine these days is not anymore a bulletproof guarantee against a third world war, because of such factors as long-range conventional strike systems, sophisticated ballistic missile defense capabilities, disruptive cyber and space technologies, or artificial intelligence. Fourthly, the sphere of arms control and confidence building measures, international and bilateral agreements, this sphere is dilapidated. The ABM treaty is buried. The conventional forces in Europe treaty is dead. The intermediate nuclear forces in Europe treaty is abandoned, and the Open Skies treaty is on its deathbed. Even the crucially important New START treaty, which was prolonged by Moscow and Washington last year, may turn out to be the last of the Mohicans. And finally, the political and strategic thinking internationally has been rapidly militarized, especially starting from the wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Nowadays, most people, for natural reasons, I should acknowledge, do not remember World War II and most conflicts in the age of the Cold War. Most people are much more concerned with the green agenda, with climate change, than with deterioration in arms control. In the past years, it has been fashionable to increase military spending, to expand borders of existing military blocs, and to develop new military clubs. Against this backdrop, the global military budget of 2 trillion, no matter how you count it, in nominal terms, in relative terms, is a monstrous pile of weaponry soaked with misperceptions and arrogance. So far, the contemporary peace movement cannot be compared to its predecessor in the 1970s or 1980s, or in 2003, when the United States, the UK, and other countries invaded Iraq. But this movement, the peace movement, today exists, is sticking and growing. The Common Security 2022 report, from my point of view, is a proof that the current peace movement, the contemporary peace movement, is buttressed by a strong intellectual, scientific endeavor and potential. And in the end, let me say that in spite of the current...
I hate to interrupt, but 2 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, maybe even less. Thank you. So in the end, let me say that in spite of the current gloomy times, I share optimism of the report. Why? Because history teaches us that diplomacy, conventional wisdom, and brighter sides of human nature have been able to overcome most dramatic challenges in human history, including numerous regional conflicts and a prevention of a new world war since 1945. So with such instruments of public and scientific diplomacy, as Common Security 2022 report, the peace movement obviously receives a powerful boost. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alexey, and thank you for persevering with your physical challenge there. I do want to say that I absolutely hope that diplomacy will prevail and prevail soon to bring us back from the brink that we face, and really appreciate your hopeful view toward the future. With that, I want to give the last word, not really the last word, but the last of the panel presentations to Reiner Braun, who is speaking to us from vacation in Italy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you for inviting me to this very important event. You know, when you are the last speaker, you can either say everything again what the further speaker has said, or you can try to come with some maybe even a little bit controversial points. And I will start with one sentence, maybe they will call me again a Putin understander, when I'm saying with all the words from Alexey Gromyko to the peace movement he was saying at the end, I absolutely agree. And my start point for agreeing with that is to say, when the Olaf Palme report in 1982 was launched, I was starting my professional work in the peace movement. And people had fear at that time that a nuclear war in Europe could happen. And we had this announcement from one of the US travel agencies saying, travel to Europe so long it is possible. And that was the reality of that time, the fear and the danger. At that time, the doomsday clock was 7 or 5 minutes to 12. Today, the doomsday clock is 100 seconds to 12. I think this shows the reality of the dangers we are facing. And when I'm looking to many words of the last week, the Ramstein meeting of these 14 foreign ministers or defense ministers, the practical sending of more weapons to Ukraine, then I think the fear comes back to Europe. The fear that a big war, and this will be a nuclear war, can happen. I think this fear has a real background. And some of my friends and colleagues were speaking about history. I think we forgot so many things of the last year. When the Olaf Palme report was launched, it was not the biggest action in the world. It was only a speech at the United General Assembly. But some years later, many points of this report become reality by the policy of one leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. We can discuss hours and hours about his mistakes, but he helped to make common security report reality. And he had a lot of the successes. But we also learned, and this is also to the lessons, that the common security ideas and thoughts were immediately after signing the Paris Charter of 1990 forgotten with the NATO expansion to the east. I'm absolutely against this illegal war of Russia against Ukraine. But I have not forgotten that this war has also a prehistory. And this has a lot of things to do with NATO. And I'm very happy that in our report, the new Olaf Palme report or the Common Security Report for our shared future is mentioned that we are not in favor of expanding military alliances and that military alliances should be ended by a common security system in Europe and in the world. I think this is an important sentence in the whole report, and I hope that we will pay much more attention to this sentence in the future. Another key point for me is, and this was also a big difference between 1980 and today. Alexey mentioned it, in 1980, millions of people were going on the streets. Today, we are trying to revitalize the peace movement, and hopefully the Common Security Report will help by revitalizing the peace movement in different parts of the world. And it is absolutely needed, this peace movement, because without the peace movement, we will, for my deep understanding, we will not get the way in the direction of the Common Security Report. What are, for me, the key changes and challenges from the report 1980 to today? What are the key challenges? The first, I think, it is a report which is a global report. And the globalization means that we say common security is needed for solving the global problems of the world, above all the climate problem, but also sustainable development goals, the hunger, poverty, and the water problem. Because all of these problems can only be solved in cooperation, in dialogue, and in trust building between the nations and the governments. The second key point for me, and this is also new, is the regionalization of the report. The Common Security Report in 1980 was, by the confrontation with the two superpowers, a report, a transatlantic or European report, to make Europe more safe. This report also questioned how we can reach common security in other parts of the world. Korean Peninsula, South China Sea, and other parts of the world. And the basics of this common security, I think, are useful for developing these common security reports and activities for different parts of the world. And one of my hope is that this report will be continued, discussed, and developed in different parts of the world. When we present and launch a report, I hope that there are coming new ideas and new coalitions in the different parts of the world for developing common security. The next point is for me, which is also new, is that this report shows the independency between environmental crisis, global injustice, and human rights. It formulates very clear that we have to reduce the military spending from 2 trillion or more than 2 trillion now, when we want to solve the global problems of the world, when we want to solve the climate problems and all these questions. And let me say two more things at the end. First of all, I think it is also a report which tries to be justice itself and not work with double standards. Yes, the illegal war in Ukraine must be accused. We need ceasefire. We need the reduction of the Russian troops. But we should not forget that in the same time, we have 21 wars in the world, and we have more than 200 armed conflicts everywhere in the world. And that the illegal attack of Russia is not the first attack during the last years. We have Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and we can continue with a long list. So we have to overcome the international double standards in the direction of common security. This means of trust building, cooperation, and acceptance of international law. This is a key point for me, that we are coming back to negotiations and general acceptance, or in the words of Olaf Palme, my security is only safe when the security of my counterpart is also safe. Saying this, as the speaker, which is deeply connected to the peace movement, I can only say that now we have to bring the key points of the report to actions, to street actions, to further actions in different countries, to more conferences, to more organizations, to get more support for the ideas of this report. This report must be something like a game changer for more activities and for a campaign for disarmament and a campaign for abolishing of nuclear weapons. And at the end, I would like to underline the need to act more against nuclear weapons. You know, we are knowing the humanitarian consequences of war. The whole campaign of the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons brought these ideas again in the middle point of many actions. But when I'm looking to the behavior and the political work of politicians and government today, they have never read anything about humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Otherwise, they could not deepen the crisis. So to overcome the crisis, we need a new thinking for common security. We need much more actions. And above all, we need an international cooperation, strongly supporting the United Nations, international cooperation for a new goal, for the goal of making common security report ready. I think we have written a quite good report. Now it's the main work to do that the report becomes political, social, emotional reality all over the world. I hope that we can do with this report a small step in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Reiner. Wonderful way to close out the panel. Just to say, there's a question here about providing text, making them available to participants and others. And as soon as I have those texts or create them from the talks, we'll put them up on the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security's webpage, and I expect our co-sponsors will want to do the same. I have a note here from Alexey saying, in essence, saying, please be kind to me with my voice. I can maybe give some short answers, but we'll see where it is if they're burning questions. So I want to go to a question from Michael Eschener. At a time when the threat of nuclear holocaust has once again arisen, and when the anti-war movement is weak and fractured, what measures can supporters of common security take to A, raise awareness of this option, B, build public support for it, and C, effectively influence members of Congress and the administration? And I think I would generalize that to expand beyond the United States. So I think the question here is essentially, how can we build support both at the popular level and within governments?
I can ask one third of the question, because I think Anna can ask the second third, and the third must be answered by someone from the US. I can only say, and I think Anna and myself agreed absolutely, that we are really starting a launching process all around the world. IPB is organizing 2 launching events in Africa now. We have 2 or 3 launching events in Asia. We are in contact with our Australian and New Zealand colleagues to organize launching events in these countries. So we really want to spread this report so widely as possible. And the consequences, hopefully, will be part of the actions at the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Conference, will be a part of the NPT conference. We will try to spread it to environmental and other groups so that we really start campaigning for this report. And I hope that in 1 year, by the invitation of the Olaf Palme Center, we can make a nice evaluation of what we reached. And hopefully the world looks at that time a little bit better than it's now.
Do you want to come in?
I could just add to what Reiner said, that we are also currently mapping all kinds of events that will take place, such as the Paris Peace Forum, etc., etc. We will hold a seminar in conjunction with the Stockholm Plus 50 conference in Stockholm in June to also integrate or show how we've integrated the climate aspects into, and the security aspects into the concept of common security. So these kind of events will be planned and held over the year to come, of course. And if there are, well, we need to be many in this, and I think I said it also in my introduction, that it's now up to all of us to take this work forward. And I think what is absolutely crucial is to involve the general public, to also reach beyond our own circles of sort of the peace movement and the progressive movements, etc., but to have a very inclusive approach to this work.
Well, I'll follow on Reiner's invitation for a U.S. answer here, and just to say that here in the United States right now, we're dealing with just a massive war fever, which really interferes with objective and critical thinking. So while we are doing all that we can to prevent the spread of the war and its escalation, and to reach a negotiated settlement, and that means, among other things, pressing our government to actually support a negotiated settlement. I mean, we're all concerned with the recent statements about really extending the war. But we need also to be raising the possibility that there will be a time, not a possibility, the reality, there will be a time after this war and the time to begin thinking about how to prevent a repeat of this, either within the North, within the Western countries, or around the world, is now. Climate change is very real. It's not going to go away. It's only being worsened by this war. In terms of steps, I mean, the most obvious thing is to begin downloading the report, writing articles about it, publishing excerpts from it, holding local discussions about it, integrating it into other work that we do. So I think there's a whole range of things that we can and must do. I had a request here from Jackie Cabasso, and let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, my question is, I think, initially for Anna. Is there any way that Finland and Sweden can be dissuaded from joining NATO? And if Alexey would like to comment on the implications of their joining NATO, that would be helpful too.
I must be honest to say that at this point in time, I think that that is unfortunately not very likely. There is now this kind of a NATO fever in both our countries, and it seems as if our both governments more or less have already decided. I think that the only thing that would change that kind of well, this debate and this sentiment is, of course, well, that the feeling of insecurity that has evoked also a big public support in our both countries for a NATO membership, that feeling of insecurity would decrease or diminish. And the only way for that to happen is, of course, a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine.
Alexey, do you want to comment on its implications?
Well, I think that if Sweden and Finland join NATO, that would be a huge loss for the history, the legacy, and the experience of neutrality in Europe. Neutral countries in Europe in the 19th century, in the 20th century, have played really a huge role in conflict prevention, in conflict settlement. And let me even guess that if Sweden had not been a neutral country back in 1982, Olaf Palme would not have been able to prepare and publish the Olaf Palme Common Security Report with the participation of heavyweights from the United States, from the Soviet Union, and from other countries. Of course, this is a sovereign right of any country to develop its way of pursuing the best configuration of its security. But let me remind us that starting from Helsinki Final Act, and then the Paris Charter, and then the European Security Charter in Istanbul in 1999, and in many other documents, there is the equation of security, which consists of two things: the sovereign right to provide your own security, and the second part of the equation is the indivisibility of security. So what I can say, if more countries become the members of NATO, then of course in Russia, the feeling of insecurity, the feeling of strategic insecurity would only grow. So let's see what is going to happen. But meanwhile, let's do whatever we can, well, to convince our politicians, our diplomats, our public, to press all sides who are participants in many conflicts across the planet to choose the diplomatic way, to go to the negotiation table, not to fuel these conflicts with more and more weaponry.
Thank you, Alexey. It's also my understanding that it's one thing for a country to apply for membership in NATO, but it then has to be, if they make the application, then has to be approved by all the member governments, which I think raises a possibility. No, Reiner is saying no. So Reiner, do you want to clarify that? And then I think we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions.
It definitely has to approve, but don't forget in which situation we are it's happened. So I think it will be very quick adopted, and officially Sweden is not a member of NATO, but don't forget that during the last years, Sweden was engaged in all NATO maneuvers, in all technical communication strategies, and. So it is this last legal step now to become a member. And this is such a big success for the NATO. They will do it so quick that they will adopt this till to the end of the year. So no illusions about that. And, you know, I absolutely can understand Alexey, that also Alexey is saying it's a little bit more cautious. But from my point of view, these change the security situation in Europe dramatically. NATO has a 1,300 kilometers long border with Russia, in addition to the border now. And these change the security situation. So for me, it is obviously that Russia will react to this change. I'm not in favor of these reactions, but please have in mind that it is obviously when the situation so much changed that there will be a reaction from the other side. So the only way to protect, not to have these reactions, we have to come back to common security, very easy.
Time maybe for a couple more questions. I have a question, I think, for Ambassador Duarte and Ambassador Kmentt, if he's still with us here, from Luis Alberto Padilla Menendez. Is it possible to consider the CD in Geneva as a means to pursue, at least in the midterm, negotiations for nuclear disarmament?
Well, the CD has been dormant now for as long as I can remember. I was a member of Brazilian delegations to the CD itself and its predecessor bodies. And at that time, there were negotiations. Some things were not really, could not be really be called real negotiations. And I'm referring here to things like the NPT, which was negotiated outside of the committee and then brought to the committee to be adopted with a few changes. But in any case, the CD has played a major role. And for a long time, it has not worked. And it reflects the general lack of understanding, lack of will to pursue avenues that can lead to real disarmament. Don't forget that that is a committee on disarmament. That's that is the object of that body. So I don't believe that at this point in time, and with the current situation, which is getting, I think, worse, getting more extreme on both sides, I think that at the current situation, it's very hard. It will be very hard to bring to the CD any initiative that could be helpful. There are a number of 2 or 3 proposals there from different countries on other aspects like outer space and other aspects that have not worked, have not been able to progress for a long time. So I have really not much faith in the ability of the CD to be useful in the current situation.
Let me sort of twist the question a little bit for Ambassador Kmentt. Could you comment on what you expect I guess the impacts of the meeting in Vienna of the first parties to the TPNW? Where do you think its contributions and its possibilities are?
First, I want to agree with what Ambassador Duarte has just said. I think the Conference on Disarmament has the most rigid rules of procedure one can imagine. Extremely, even the slightest change, all procedural issues need to be done by consensus, and it has become a playground for an approach that basically stops any progress, unfortunately. So it certainly doesn't do the multilateral system honor, what's going on in the Conference on Disarmament for 25 years now. On the first meeting of states parties for the TPNW, I think is very clearly a common security treaty, because it looks looks at nuclear weapons from the perspective of global consequences and risks, which have to be borne by all nations, by everybody on this planet, and that is based on empirical evidence. So that's extremely important. The first meeting of states parties is an opportunity to put the implementation of this new treaty on a solid track. It's an opportunity to demonstrate with every additional country that joins that nuclear deterrence, that the legitimacy of nuclear deterrence is put into question. So states parties have been working on the preparation for this treaty very seriously, and are intent to demonstrate that this is a norm that is going to grow. And of course, it's a discursive process. So we are making the arguments for nuclear disarmament based on the understanding of the consequences and risks, and we want to implicate those that are still not convinced by that. We're working together with civil society, with the Red Cross. It's a long process, we all understand that, but it is an effective measure to take nuclear disarmament forward. And even the biggest skeptics of the TPNW will share the view that for the maintenance of a world without nuclear weapons, a prohibition is necessary. It's a conceptual condition to have that. So we are building this norm. We are building this norm against mighty opponents in a very difficult context, but based on very profound arguments. And a few weeks afterwards, the NPT review conference will take place, which will most likely, unfortunately, demonstrate that in that treaty, progress is very difficult to achieve. So states that want to take a clear stand in favor of nuclear disarmament have the TPNW to make this point. And we are building a norm. I think that's a huge contribution to nuclear disarmament and to a common security paradigm.
Thank you, Ambassador Kmentt. We've got 2 months essentially between now and your conference, and I wish you every success in building it. I want to close out with one last question here, I think to maybe Anna and Reiner. It comes from Dennis Wong, and he wants to know if does common security care if a country is a democracy or an autocracy? Who wants to go first?
I can just briefly say that no, it doesn't really. But of course, there could be implications to the building of trust, in the sense that, well, we know that democracies very rarely also fight one another with military means. Well, for the building of trust, at least, the playing by the rules of the game, so to say, to abide to international laws, etc., is of course important for the trust building, which is a prerequisite for the concept of common security. And well, I think on a general level, we could say that democracies tend to play by the rules, at least more often, even though, of course, there are also plenty of examples where they have not. Well, a brief answer to a more complex question, of course.
Reiner, you get the last word here.
You know, democracy is definitely our goal, and we are underlining the importance of democracy in our report. But in this difficult world, we also need cooperation and common security with authoritarian states and with states we don't love. The world is so much connected and needs these common ideas and common security, even when we don't share all the values of all countries, and our own value is democracy. And we will definitely, as peace movement, as engaged people, fighting for more peace and for more democracy in the world. But I want to solve conflicts and wars also with countries which are not supporting my values and not supporting our democracy values, because, and then I'm by Willy Brandt, peace is not everything, but nothing is without peace. I think this is the lecture we learned from the Cold War and from the new confrontation we are living in now.
Just as we close, I want to also harken back to Anno Chenoy, who must have decided it was so late that she had to sign off. But you know, to note in her speech, in her talk, she really pointed to the absolute importance of recognizing the differences between our nations and cultures, and the need to find ways to communicate and collaborate together. And without that, there's not a whole lot of hope for the future. So I want to appreciate that. In closing, I'd like to ask Mariana Fernandez if you could put up the closing slide there that has the link to the report, so people can get a last shot at that link. I want to express just deep appreciation to Mariana for making our gathering, our really international global webinar here possible. And I want to express just my deepest gratitude and appreciation to each of our speakers, not only for your contributions here today, but for the work that you put into creating the Common Security 22 report, and for everything else that you do to really help to contribute to human survival. You know, I think we increasingly understand with both the nuclear and climate threats, also pandemic, that human life on this planet is absolutely fragile. And it's the work of people like you and others who are in this meeting that really make our survival possible. So together, let's do the work we need to do. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and thank you so much. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.